Hello student, welcome to the lecture on US environmental policy, and after this lecture we will able to learn the following objectives. Explain the history of US environmental policy, discuss the influencing environmental policy, define the Nixon administration, understand the Reagan administration, explain the George H.W. Bush administration 1989 to 1993, discuss the Clinton administration 1993 to 2001, define the global environmental policy, explain the environmental regulation. Many people in the United States have demonstrated a concern about environmental problems in both local and national elections. In the United States, candidates often talk about environmental issues in their campaigns. In recent decades, the United States has reduced many types of pollution and improved water quality in many places. But the United States is still struggling to use its resources in a sustainable way and to preserve its unique ecosystems. History of US environmental policy. During the 1800s, people in the United States made use of the country's vast resources. Prairies were turned into cropland, ancient forests were cut down, and several species of animals were hunted to extinction. By the 1900s, citizens began to realize the consequences of these actions, and the citizens' attitudes started to change. Environmental agencies and laws. Throughout the 1900s, US citizens became more aware of environmental problems. Widespread crop disasters in the 1930s showed the country that poor farming practices were causing soil erosion and poverty. Policies to encourage soil conservation were adopted. People objected to living near smelly garbage dumps, so research on better methods of waste disposal began. The first Earth Day celebrated around the world in 1970 was a sign of widespread environmental awareness. In the same year, the US Environmental Protection Agency (EPA) was created. The EPA uses regulations and economic incentives to encourage individuals and businesses to meet these standards. Many of these laws continue to use debate among citizens. Some citizens debate whether economic and personal freedoms are equal to long-term social interests. Some debate whether policies are based on science or on political trends. Meanwhile, many citizens are equally concerned about international politics, migration, and trade. Influencing environmental policy. We can have more influence on environmental policy than we may realize. For example, as a citizen, we can contact our elected representatives to tell them our opinion on issues. Many laws related to the environmental are created at the national level. However, there are also many states and local laws that affect the environment. It is easier for an individual to influence policy at the local level than at the national level. Local government is more responsive to citizen input than state or federal government is. It is also usually easier for citizens to organize and contact their representatives at the local level. Local governments. Local governments and planning boards make many decisions for their communities. City councils and governmental agencies hold public meetings in which citizens may participate. One common problem with local environmental planning is that communities often do not coordinate planning with each other. On the other hand, sometimes several local communities work together. State governments. Environmental policies also strongly influence at the state level. The federal government passes laws that set environmental standards, but often these laws are minimum standards. States also have a lot of independent control over how to implement laws and manage public resources. Lobbying. Lawmakers are heavily influenced by lobbying on many sides of issues is an organized attempt to influence the decision of lawmakers. Both environmental and industry groups are hired lobbyists to provide information to lawmakers and urge them to vote a certain way. The media and sources of information. The media, especially television news, is the main source of information about environmental topics for most of us. If we want to understand environmental problems, we will want to find information from sources other than popular media. Many other sources are available, and we should evaluate all sources for bias and accuracy. The Nixon administration 1969 to 74. President Nixon and his Special Assistant for National Security, Henry A. Kissinger, were not proponents of using the United Nations in U.S. foreign policy. Nixon and Kissinger considered themselves realists who believed national self-interest and major power relation were the only real consideration for foreign policy. Nixon and Kissinger considered themselves realists who believed national self-interest and major power relation were the only real consideration for foreign policy. The secret bombing of Cambodia. One of the biggest criticism of the Nixon administration is the secret bombing campaign of Cambodia, a neutral and defenseless country in Southeast Asia. Nixon's description of the decision to bomb Cambodia, which he made as a new president, was surprisingly similar to Kennedy's indoctrination as a new president when faced with the Bay of Pigs ordeal in April of 1961. Nixon's 8-point strategy to end the Vietnam War. When Nixon campaigned for the presidency in 1968, he pledged repeatedly that he had a secret plan to end the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was a major liability for him politically. Few Americans would have objected, not even supporters of the war. The first point was to dramatically increase American aid to Israel. In a word, Nixon bought them off. By doing so, he created division among friends of Israel. The second point was to initiate a program called Vietnamization, which reduced American forces in South Vietnam from 5,40,000 in January 1969 to 3,35,000 by late 1970, then to 1,60,000 by late 1971, and finally a complete withdrawal by the end of 1973. The third point was to establish diplomatic relations with China. Nixon personally visited China in February 1972 after a 21-year estrangement with the United States. The fourth point was to establish detente with the Soviet Union. In May of 1972, Nixon paid a state visit to Moscow to sign 10 formal agreements, the most important of which were the nuclear arms limitation treaties known as SALT I. The fifth point was to break up Auguste Joseph Ricard's heroin cartel. The sixth point was to intensify US bombing of North Vietnam in order to get that government to participate in the Paris peace talks. The seventh point was to withdraw American forces from Vietnam. By the time Nixon did this, he had done several other things. The first 6 points to set the stage for the 7th point. The 8th point was to abolish the draft completely. This made it extremely difficult for succeeding president to get involved in another Vietnam War. The conclusion of the Vietnam War. In March 1972, the North Vietnamese invaded the demilitarized zone DMZ and captured Quang Tri province. President Nixon responded by ordering the mining of Haiphong and other North Vietnamese ports and an intense bombing of the north. The relentless Christmas bombing forced the North Vietnamese back to the Paris peace talks, which resulted in a ceasefire agreement on January 27, 1973. In August, the US Congress proscribed any further US military activity in Indochina. By the end of 1973, there were few US military personnel left in South Vietnam. In December 1974, the North Vietnamese attacked Duoc Binh, a provincial capital about 60 miles 100 km north of Saigon. Their capture of this city in early January 1975 convinced the North Vietnamese that a full-scale invasion of the South was now practicable. A military government was instituted, and on July 2, 1976, the country was officially united as a Socialist Republic of Vietnam with its capital in Hanoi. Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City. The Watergate burglary, June 17, 1972. Near the end of President Nixon's first term on June 17, 1972, 5 men were arrested, breaking into the Democratic National Headquarters in the Watergate office apartment building in Washington, D.C. It was quickly learned that the arrested burglars had been hired by the committee to re-elect the president, CRP. Immediately, Attorney General John Mitchell resigned as director of the CRP. A few days after the break-in, charges of burglary and wiretapping were brought against the 5 men arrested at the scene, plus 2 additional officials within the Nixon administration. They were E. Howard Hunt Jr., a former White House aide, and G. Gordon Liddy, General Counsel for the Committee for the Re-election of the President. The Reagan administration, 1980-1989. In his inaugural address after taking the oath of office on January 20, Ronald Reagan called upon Americans to begin an era of national renewal. Arguably, the first conservative US president in over 50 years, Reagan advanced domestic policies that featured a lessening of federal government responsibility in solving social problems, reducing restrictions on business, and implementing tax cuts. Economic policy. When Reagan took office, the economy was one of the double-digit inflation and high interest rates. During the campaign, Reagan promised to restore the free market from excessive government regulation and encourage private initiative and enterprise. Reagan's economic policies came to be known as Reaganomics, an attempt, according to Lau Cannon, to balance the federal budget, increase defense spending, and cut income taxes. Domestic affairs. Reagan's domestic policies had a major impact on the American people and will have for many years. He followed the passage of the largest tax cut in US history by supporting and signing into law the Tax Reform Law of 1986. Reagan consistently received very high approval ratings, although he was not popular with some minority groups, particularly blacks, many of whom did not benefit from the economic prosperity. Reagan encouraged the development of private sector initiative as well as federalism, with the objective of transferring from the federal government some of the responsibilities believed to be better served by private business or state and local government. Foreign policy. At the heart of Reagan's foreign policy was the prevention of communist expansion. Reagan believed that the nation should negotiate with the Soviet Union from a position of strength. To such an end, the administration embarked on a strategic modernization program which included the production of intercontinental missile and a feasibility study for the Strategic Defense Initiative. The Reagan legacy. The 8 years of the Reagan's presidency was one of the most dynamic periods in the recent US history, resulting in a major refocusing of the nation's social, business, and international agenda. Support for Ronald Reagan grew when he was seriously wounded by an assassin's bullet in 1981 and during major surgical procedures in 1985 and 1987. Reagan was known as a great communicator and often went on television to ask the viewers for their support for a particular piece of legislation. Reagan had a clear social, economic and foreign policy agenda, and with political guile and personal persuasiveness, he was able to achieve many of his goals. The George H.W. Bush administration 1989-1993. President Reagan enjoyed unusually high popularity at the end of his second term in office, but under the terms of the US Constitution, he could not run again in 1988. The Republican nomination went to Vice President George Herbert Walker Bush, who was elected the 41st President of the United States. During his first year in office, Bush followed a conservative fiscal program, pursuing policies on taxes, spending and debt that were faithful to the Reagan administration's economic program. The Bush administration advanced new policy initiatives in areas not requiring major new federal expenditure. Thus, in November 1990, Bush signed sweeping legislation imposing new federal standards on urban smoke, automobile exhaust, toxic air population and acid rain, but with industrial polluters bearing most of the cost. Budgets and deficit. Bush administration efforts to gain control over the federal budget deficit, however, were more problematic. One source of the difficulty was the savings and loan crisis. In January 1990, President Bush presented his budget proposal to Congress. Democrats argued that administration budget projections were far too optimistic and that meeting the deficit reduction law would require tax increases and sharper cuts in defense spending. End to the Cold War. When Bush became president, the Soviet Empire was on the verge of collapse. Gorbachev's efforts to open up the USSR's economy appeared to be floundering. In 1989, the communist governments in one Eastern European country after another simply collapsed after it became clear that Russian troops would not be sent to prop them up. The Bush administration adeptly brokered the end of the Cold War, working closely with Gorbachev and Yeltsin. The disposal of nuclear materials and the ever-present concerns of nuclear proliferation now superseded the threat of nuclear conflict between Washington and Moscow. The Gulf War. The euphoria caused by the drawing down of the Cold War was dramatically overshadowed by the August 2, 1990 invasion of the small nation of Kuwait by Iraq. Iraq under Saddam Hussein and Iran under its Islamic fundamentalist regime had emerged as the two major military powers in the oil-rich Persian Gulf area. In United States, coalition with Great Britain, France, Italy, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait and other countries succeeded in liberating Kuwait with a devastating US-led air campaign that lasted slightly more than a month. It was followed by a massive invasion of Kuwait and Iraq by armed and airborne infantry forces. With their superior speed, mobility and firepower, the elite forces overwhelmed the Iraqi forces in a land campaign lasting only 100 hours. The victory, however, was incomplete and unsatisfying. The UN resolution, which Bush enforced to the letter, called only for the expulsion of Iraq from Kuwait. Saddam Hussein remained in power, savagely repressing the Kurds in the north and the Shiites in the south, both of whom the United States had encouraged to rebel. Panama and NAFTA. The president also received broad bipartisan congressional backing for the brief U.S. invasion of Panama on December 20, 1989 that deposed dictator General Manuel Antonio Noriega. On the economic front, the Bush administration negotiated the North America Free Trade Agreement (NAFTA) with Mexico and Canada. It would be ratified after an intense debate in the first year of the Clinton administration. The Clinton administration 1993-2001. When President Clinton took office in 1993, the United States had no direct diplomatic relation with Iran. Any prospect of improvement was complicated by sanctions dating back to the 1979 US Embassy takeover and an American public intensely distrustful of the Islamic Republic's policies. Shortly after the inauguration, the administration announced that its policy toward Tehran would be part of a larger dual containment in the Gulf to limit the threats posed by both Iraq and Iran to US interests and allies. The Lebanon's problem. Throughout both terms, the Clinton administration faced several crises in Lebanon between Israel and the Iranian-backed Hezbollah. Washington suspected the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, who had been deployed to Lebanon since 1982, of fomenting trouble, although Israeli actions occasionally into Hezbollah's hand. The White House often had to rely on Syria, Iran's ally, to defuse crisis in Lebanon. The specter of Iranian-backed terror grew worse at the end of Clinton's first term. Khobar Towers attack. On June 25, 1996, a truck bomb exploded at the US Air Force facility in Khobar, Saudi Arabia, killing 19 Americans and wounding over 350 Americans, Saudis and other nationals. Intelligence indicated the bombing was the work of Hezbollah al-Hijaz, a Saudi group with close links to Iran's Revolutionary Guards and Lebanon's Hezbollah. Dialogues of civilization. The surprise victory of Mohammad Khatami in 1997 presidential elections offered the second Clinton administration an opportunity to restore US-Iran relations. Over the next 3 years, Clinton sent a series of public messages affirming his interest in improving people-to-people relations. His messages at Nowruz and Eid al-Fitr, end of Ramadan feast, expressed appreciation for Iranian culture. US-Iran sports exchanges received high-level attention at the White House. An American wrestling team that traveled to Iran was photographed with the president in the Oval Office. Sanctions on import of various Iranian goods, including carpets and pistachio nuts, were also gradually eased. The Omani Gambit. In June 1999, Clinton sent Bruce Riedel and Martin Indyk to Fontainebleau, France, to carry written and oral messages to Khatami to be delivered by Oman. They met with Sultan Qaboos at his chateau and asked him to send his foreign minister Yusuf bin Alawi to Tehran to deliver the messages. While Washington sought better relations with Iran, it could not allow the murder of American citizens to pass unaddressed. Clinton asked for assurances that Iran would cease involvement in terrorist attacks and that those responsible for Khobar would be brought to justice. Alawi delivered the message to Khatami in July 1999. Khatami told Alawi he appreciated Clinton's efforts to improve relations. He promised to look at the Khobar issue. The Islamic Republic did not formally respond for 6 weeks. In September 1999, Iran told the Omanis that it had conducted a reliable investigation and serious scrutiny of the Khobar attack and concluded that US allegations about the Revolutionary Guards were inaccurate and fabricated. Albright's speech. In a major speech on March 17, 2000, Albright formally apologized for the CIA's role in the 1953 coup that overthrew Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh's government and restored the monarchy, a major Iranian demand for years. She also announced the lifting of sanctions on imports of Iranian food and carpets and approval for export of spare parts for Iran's aging Boeing aircraft. A few days later, Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei dismissed Albright's remarks as worthless. He also accused the United States of backing Iran in the Iran-Iraq war and refused any official dialogue with America. Global Environmental Policy. The Global Environmental Policy Program is comprised of courses in global policy studies, environmental science, economics, international environmental politics, and environmental law. The policy component includes both classroom and experiential learning opportunities that build a strong foundation in the legal and political dimensions of policy formation and implementation. Climate change programs. The following some points of climate changes programs: Department of Agriculture, Global Climate Change. The Global Change Program Office GCPO function as the department-wide coordinator of agriculture, rural and forestry related global change program and policy issues facing USDA. The office ensures that USDA is a source of objective analytical assessments of the effects of climate change and proposed response strategies. Department of Commerce, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration NOAA, Climate. The NOAA is charged with helping society understand, plan for and respond to climate variability and change. This is achieved through the development and delivery of climate information services, the implementation of a global observing system, and focused research and modeling to understand key climate processes. Department of Energy, Energy Information Administration EIA. The EIA site provides official energy statistics from the US government and includes US and international emissions data along with information on greenhouse gas reporting, environmental analysis, emission forecasts and historical environmental indicators. Department of Energy, Office of Biological of Environmental Research, Climate and Environmental Sciences Division. The DOE's climate change research programs support 4 contributing areas of research: climate and hydrology, atmospheric chemistry and carbon cycle, ecological processes and human interaction. Department of Health and Human Services, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Climate Change and Public Health. Experts at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention cannot predict how climate change will affect society and public health, but CDC is working to address the health issues that may be associated with global climate change. Department of the Interior US, Geological Survey USGS, Climate Change Science. The Earth's surface is a dynamic system of which humans are a part. USGS global change research activities strive to achieve a whole system understanding of the interrelationship among Earth's surface processes, ecological system and human activities. Department of the Interior USGS, Office of Global Change. The USGS strives to understand how the Earth works and to anticipate changes in how the Earth functions. To accomplish this, USGS science aims to understand the interrelationship among Earth's surface, processes, ecological system and human activities. Department of Justice Environmental Management System. The Department of Justice DOJ is committed to reducing the environmental impact of its activities throughout the organization. Department of State Climate Change. The United States has initiated a number of policies and partnerships that span a wide range of initiatives from reducing emissions at home to developing transformational low-carbon technologies to improving observation systems that will help to better understand and address the possible impacts of climate change. Environmental regulation. Environmental regulation can impact a business at any time. One produce products that could potentially harm the environment, are engaged in agriculture, farming, or need to dispose of pollutants or hazardous or non-hazardous waste, one must comply with the law. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency (EPA) and state environmental agencies regulate the impact of businesses on the environment. The EPA develops and enforces regulation that implements environment laws enacted by Congress. The economic impact of environmental regulation. The political debate over environmental policies has never been as contentious or rancorous as it is today. In Washington, the new Congress is moving swiftly to roll back 25 years of environmental legislation and regulation. Of course, environmental deregulation will not be cost-free. Steady progress toward cleaner air, water, and land will be slowed significantly if not reversed. While this may be of small concern in still pristine stages such as Wyoming, the implication for public health, ecology, and quality of life in states such as New Jersey are dire. Summary. Now in the end, let us summarize what we have learned in this lecture. Explain the history of US environmental policy, discuss the influencing environmental policy, define the Nixon administration, understand the Reagan administration, explain the George H.W. Bush administration 1989 to 1993, discuss the Clinton administration 1993 to 2001, define the global environmental policy, explain the environmental regulation,